In 1978, an archaeology professor named Jeff Brown was walking down Market Street in downtown Chattanooga, Tennessee, after a rainstorm, and he noticed that the water running along the base of the old brick buildings was disappearing downward into cracks and seams at the very bottom of the facades, into gaps that should not have been there. Brown crouched down where the brickwork met the concrete and saw something that thousands of people had walked past every day without ever looking closely enough to notice: the top of a brick arch, half buried in the ground, with a wooden frame still visible on either side and a keystone wedged into the crown. The kind of arch you put over a window when you want it to last 100 years and let the light in. Except this window was entirely underground, sealed beneath the sidewalk, looking out into nothing but packed earth and darkness. Brown went inside the building and took the stairs down to what the directory called the basement, but when he reached the bottom, he understood immediately that this was not a basement. The ceiling was too high, the staircase too wide, the banister too ornate, and in the far wall there was a window framed in wood, and behind the glass there was no view, no alley, no courtyard, just a wall of compacted soil pressed flat against the pane, as though someone had buried the entire outside of the building up to the second story and never told anyone why. He walked out, crossed 3 blocks, entered another building, descended to its basement, and found the same thing: doorways opening into solid earth, windows facing dirt, ornamental millwork finished to a standard that no one wastes on a room built underground. Every building he checked told the same story, and the story was that downtown Chattanooga was standing on the second floor, and whatever had been the first floor was still down there, buried under 6 to 20 feet of fill that had no engineering plans, no city ordinance, and almost no mention in the historical record. But the part that kept Brown awake was not what he found under Market Street. It was what he could not find in any archive, any newspaper, any government file, when he started looking for a single credible explanation of who ordered this, when it happened, and what was down there before the dirt arrived. This video follows 4 threads, and each one leads deeper underground. First, what did Jeff Brown discover beneath downtown Chattanooga, and why did utility workers tell him about tunnels and doorways that were not on any map? Second, what happened in March of 1867, when the Tennessee River rose 58 feet and turned the city into an inland sea? And what did Chattanooga do afterward that resulted in an entire floor of its downtown being erased from the surface? Third, why is there almost no documentation of a project that would have required moving thousands of tons of fill, regrading miles of streets, and burying the ground floor of every commercial building in the district? And fourth, Chattanooga is not the only city with a buried floor. So what happened across the United States in the second half of the 19th century that left so many cities standing 1 story higher than they were built? Subscribe now if you want to keep finding this channel, because the algorithm does not want you watching content like this. Now let us go back to 1867, because to understand what is underneath Chattanooga, you first have to understand what Chattanooga was before the river erased it. Chattanooga in the 1860s was a city built in the wrong place for the right reasons, wedged into a bend of the Tennessee River between Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge, in a valley that funneled every drop of Appalachian rainwater directly through its streets. The river had flooded before, and each time the damage was bad enough that a sensible community might have relocated. But Chattanooga was not sensible. It was a railroad junction, one of the most strategically important in the South, and during the Civil War, both armies had fought over it, because whoever held the rail hub controlled supply movement across the Tennessee Valley. By 1865, the war was over, and the rebuilding had barely started when merchants along Market and Broad began putting up commercial buildings with brick facades, limestone foundations, tall windows on the ground floor to draw customers, and finished basement levels with decorative millwork and arched entryways designed for retail use. These were not frontier shacks. These were urban commercial structures built by people who invested in ornamental stonework because they expected the buildings to stand for a century. The first floors were the most important, widest entrances, biggest windows, most elaborate detailing, all facing the street. And then, in March of 1867, the Tennessee River rose at a rate of 1 foot per hour and did not stop until it had climbed 58 feet above its normal level, which meant downtown Chattanooga was not just flooded, but submerged under several feet of churning water that carried livestock, timber, and entire structures downstream. The military bridge was ripped from its foundations. At least 100 buildings below Cameron Hill simply ceased to exist. A steamboat captain piloted his vessel up Broad Street, picking up stranded residents from the upper floors of commercial buildings as though the road had become a river channel, which for all practical purposes it had. By the time the water receded, the city was wrecked, and its residents were left with one question: how do you rebuild in a valley the river can swallow whenever it wants? The answer, according to the official narrative, is that they raised the streets. But the way they did it, and the evidence they left behind, does not match the story they told. The official explanation goes like this. After 1867, citizens collectively decided to raise the downtown street level above the flood line by hauling in dirt, rock, and fill, dumping it around the bases of existing buildings, and burying the ground floor beneath a new elevated grade. Second floors became first floors. Old windows now faced earth. Doorways that once opened onto sidewalks now opened into walls of fill. Life continued 1 story higher. This was not unprecedented. Chicago did something similar in the 1850s, physically jacking up buildings and packing fill underneath, and the whole process was documented in engineering journals, city council records, and newspaper coverage that fills entire library shelves. Seattle rebuilt above its old ground level after the 1889 fire, and you can walk through the buried streets on a guided tour today. But Chattanooga has almost nothing. No engineering plans for regrading Market Street, no city council resolution authorizing the burial. No newspaper series documenting the work, no photographs of crews hauling fill, no contracts, no budgets, no timelines. Brown spent years looking and found nearly none of it. He told a Rotary meeting in 1978 that the fill material was easily distinguishable from original soil when you dug into it. It had definitely been brought in from elsewhere. But the questions of who organized it, who paid for it, which streets to raise and by how much, all of that existed in a documentary void that Brown called inexplicable. And the scale was enormous. This was not one building or one block. This was an entire commercial district, from the river to at least 9th Street, buried at depths of 6 to 20 feet. Thousands of tons of material, placed precisely enough to create a functional new street grid on top of the old one. Projects like that leave records everywhere except Chattanooga. And that absence is what turned Brown's architectural curiosity into something much harder to explain away, because he was not just finding buried windows, he was finding what was behind them. Brown did not just look at arches poking out of sidewalks. He went inside the buildings, one by one, and documented what he found beneath them. Utility workers who maintained downtown Chattanooga's underground infrastructure told him about spaces not on any city map, rooms behind walls, corridors connecting buildings at a level below the street, doorways that opened into earth and at once opened into air. These were physical spaces the crews accessed regularly and the city had never catalogued. In the Loveman Building at 800 Market Street, a department store built in the 1880s, the basement told a story the street above contradicted. A wide staircase with carved banisters led to a level finished with plaster walls, decorative trim, the kind of investment a builder makes only when he expects the public to see the space and spend money in it. In the northern wall, brick archways framed in wood opened into alcoves that terminated in retaining walls of packed earth, as though the building once had entrances on that side that now faced nothing but fill. At the United Way building on 7th Street, arched window tops were visible at sidewalk level, ornamental crowns designed to be admired from the street, now sitting at ankle height with the rest of the window buried. Building after building told the same story. The most expensive details, the most elaborate stonework, the widest entrances, the biggest windows, all underground, all below the current grade, all designed to face the public, and now sitting in darkness behind dirt. Brown called it Underground Chattanooga and hoped it would become an attraction, something the city could open to the world the way Seattle had. But the spaces were fragmented, scattered across dozens of privately owned buildings with no unified access. And then, in December of 1980, Jeff Brown died. He never completed his survey. No one picked up where he left off. The question he had been chasing, who buried the first floor and why is there no record, was left exactly where he dropped it. But it did not stay quiet forever. In 2015, a local researcher named David Moon published 2 years of work on underground Chattanooga using an approach Brown never had: systematic photographic comparison. Moon collected every historical photograph of downtown he could find, images of Market and Broad from the 1870s through the early 1900s, and compared them with modern photographs of the same locations. He was looking for the proof Brown never found, a photograph showing Market Street at a visibly lower grade than today, the before and after evidence that the streets had been raised. What Moon found was more complicated. The photographs did not show a single dramatic raising. They showed gradual, piecemeal change, sections filled in at different times for different reasons over decades. Some areas regraded for railroad construction, others filled when streetcar lines went in. The sports barn area showed significant fill in the early 1900s for municipal car barns. But none of these added up to the district-wide burial the physical evidence inside the buildings demanded. Moon was cautious. Not enough photographic evidence to confirm a single organized effort, but too much physical evidence to deny something happened. Dr. Nick Honekamp, who now directs the Jeffrey L. Brown Institute of Archaeology at the university, put it in one sentence that has never been adequately answered. Why would you put in a window that you cannot see out of? You would not. Which means the window was built when there was something to see, and at some point that something was replaced with fill and a parking meter. And here is where Chattanooga stops being a local curiosity and becomes part of something much larger. Seattle has its underground, Chicago raised entire blocks. Portland has tunnels beneath Old Town with arched doorways and window frames facing earth. Atlanta has underground Atlanta, buried storefronts sealed beneath viaducts. Each city has its own explanation: fire, flooding, drainage, railroad construction. But when you step back and look at the map, a pattern emerges that no city-by-city story addresses. Across the United States, in cities separated by hundreds or thousands of miles, the same anomaly appears in buildings from the same era, the second half of the 19th century. First floors below the current grade, windows facing dirt, doorways opening into fill. The richest architectural detail on the story that is now underground. Each city explains its own case. None of them explains why the same thing happened everywhere in the same 50-year window. And the cities are not random. They cluster along river systems, railroad corridors, and the routes of westward expansion being developed between the Civil War and the turn of the century. The same decades when the wealthiest dynasties consolidated control over railroads, banking, steel, and energy. The same decades when grand civic buildings appeared in frontier towns that had barely existed 10 years earlier, built to a standard of sophistication the official labor force of the era struggles to explain. Chattanooga's buried floor is one data point in a continental pattern that the official record treats as unrelated local decisions, but that, viewed from above, looks like something much larger happened to the ground level of American cities in the second half of the 1800s. And whatever it was not adequately recorded, not in Chattanooga, not anywhere. There is a question underneath this entire investigation that is simple to ask and apparently impossible to get a straight answer to. If the citizens of Chattanooga decided to bury their own ground floor, why did they not write it down? This was not a primitive outpost. By the 1870s, Chattanooga had newspapers, a city government, a county court system, property registries, and a commercial class that documented transactions and permits as routine business. A project requiring thousands of tons of fill, miles of regrading, and the cooperation of every property owner in the district would have generated mountains of paper. And yet there is almost nothing, not suppressed, not classified, just absent, as though no one thought to mention it, or as though the people who did it had reasons for not wanting it recorded. Brown could not explain the gap. Moon could not. Honekamp has acknowledged the physical evidence without producing the documentation that would make underground Chattanooga an established fact instead of a local legend. The buildings are the most reliable witnesses, and what they testify to is straightforward. They were built with first floors facing the street, and at some point those first floors were buried. The buildings did not move, the ground moved, and nobody wrote it down. That absence could be negligence, lost records, or inconsistent 19th century bookkeeping, but it is also exactly what you would expect if the burial was not a planned civic project at all, if it was something that happened to the city rather than something the city chose to do. The buried first floor of Chattanooga is still there right now, underneath Market Street and Broad Street and 7th Street and every other block where Jeff Brown walked in 1978 and saw arched windows poking out of the concrete at angle height. The Loveman Building still has its wide staircase leading down to a finished floor that was never meant to be a basement. The United Way Building still has brick arches visible at sidewalk level. 50,000 people live in this city, driving to work over buried storefronts, parking above sealed doorways, eating lunch in restaurants whose basements contain rooms designed to face the public and have not seen natural light in over 100 years. Brown died in 1980 without finding the document that explained what happened. No one has found it since. The institute that carries his name has not produced a comprehensive survey of the underground spaces he identified. The buildings are privately owned. The basements are closed to the public. The city has no plans to open them, and the question Brown asked in 1978, who buried the first floor of Chattanooga, and when, and why, remains exactly where he left it, unanswered, underground, behind a window that once faced daylight and now faces 20 feet of dirt and the underside of a parking meter. Subscribe if you want to see what else is buried under American soil. The next investigation is already in production. I will see you there.